aboard the Hulk. Now, when it came to my watch, which I took company with the big seaman, the moon had not yet risen, and the island was vastly dark. Sorry, something seems off. Save for the hilltop, from which the fire blazed in this four places, and very busy they kept us, supplying them with fuel. Apologies. All right. We're gonna start over again. My apologies. Aboard the Hulk. Now, when it came to my watch, which I took in company with the big seaman, the moon had not yet risen, and the island was vastly dark, save the hilltop, which from the fires blazed in a score many places, and very busy they kept us, supplying them with fuel. Then, when maybe about half of our watch had passed, the seaman, who had been to feed the fires upon the weed side of the hilltop, came across to me, and bade me come and put my hand upon the lesser rope. And for that, the ship, were anxious to haul it in so that they might send some message across to us. At his words, I asked him very anxiously whether he had received them waving a light, the which we had arranged to be our method of signaling in the night, and avenge such things be needful. But to this he had said that he had seen not, and by now, having come clear near the edge of the cliff, I could see for myself and perceive that there was no signaling from the Hulk. Yet, to please the fellow, I put my hand upon the line, in which we had made fast in the evening to a large piece of rock, and so, immediately, I discovered something was pulling upon it. Hauling and then slacking, it so occurred to me, too, that the people in the vessel might be indeed wishful to send us some message, and at that, to make sure, I ran to the nearest fire, and, lighting it up a weed, I waved it thrice, but there came not any answering signal from those in the ship, and at that, I went back to feel the rope, to assure myself that it had not been plucked of the wind upon it. But I found that it was something very different from the wind, something that had plucked with all the sharpness of a fish, only that it had been a mighty fish to give it such tugs. And so, I knew that something vile out in the darkness of that of the weed was fast to the rope. And at this there came a fear that it might break it, and then a second thought that there might be something climbing up through the rope. And so I bade the big seaman to stand ready with his great cutlass, whilst I ran and waked the bosun. And this I did, and explained to him how something meddled with the lesser rope, so that he came immediately to see himself how this might be. And when he put his hand upon it, he bade me to go and cast all the rest of the men, and let them stand round the fires, for that there was something abroad in the night, and we might be in danger of an attack. But he and the big seaman stayed by the end of the rope, watching, so that as far as darkness would allow, and ever and anon feeling the tension upon it. Then suddenly he came to the bosun to look at the second line, and he ran, cursing himself for his thoughtlessness. But because of its greater weight and tension, he could not discover for certain whether anything was meddling with it or not. Yet he stayed with it, arguing that if he ought touch the smaller rope, then something might do likewise with the greater. Only the small lay line along the weed, whilst the greater one had been some feet above it, when the darkness had fallen over us, and so might be free from any prowling creatures. And thus, maybe an hour passed, and we kept watch, and tended to the fires, going from one to another. And presently, coming to that which the nearest the bosun, I went to him, intending to pass a few minutes in talk. But as I drew nigh to him, I chanced to place my hand upon the big rope, and that I exclaimed in surprise, for it had become much slacker than when I last felt it in the evening. And I asked the bosun whether it touched it, whereat he felt the rope, and he was almost more amazed than I had been, for when he last touched it had been much more taut, humming in the wind. Now, upon this discovery, he was in much fear that something had bitten through it, and called to the men to come all of them and pull upon the rope, so that he might discover whether it was indeed parted. But when they came and hauled upon it, they were unable to gather any of it, whereat we felt all of us mighty relieved in our minds, though I still unable to come to the cause of its sudden slackness. And so, while later, there rose the moon, and we were able to examine the island and the water between it and the weed continent, to see whether there was anything stirring yet. Neither in the valley nor in the faces of the cliff nor in the open water could we see aught living. And as for anything among the weed, it was small. He was trying to discover it among all the shaky blackness. And now, being assured that nothing was coming upon us, and that, so far our eyes could pierce, there climbed nothing upon the ropes, and the bosun bade us all turn in, all except those whose time it was to watch. Yet, before I went to the tent, I made careful examination of the big rope, the which did also the bosun, perceived no cause for slackness. Now this was quite apparent in the moonlight. The rope going down with greater abruptness than it had done in the evening, and so we cannot conceive that they had to halt at slack for some reason. And after that, we went into the tent and had a further spell of sleep. In the early morning, we were waked by one of the watchmen coming into the tent to call the bosun, Port Beard though had moved in that night, so that its stern was now pointed somewhat towards the island. At this news we all ran, all of us from the tent to the edge of the hill, and found it indeed, as the man had said. Now I understood that sudden slackening of the rope, for after withstanding the stress upon it for some hours, the vessel had indeed yielded and slewed its stern towards us, moving also to some extent partly in our direction. Now we discovered that the man had placed at the top of the structure, waving a welcome to us, and which we waved back. And then the bosun bade me hasten to write a note to know whether it seemed likely that they might be able to heave the ship clear of the weed. And this I did, greatly excited within myself, as this new thought indeed was the bosun himself and the rest of the men. Or could they do this, then how easily solve the very problem of our coming to our country? But it seemed too good of a thing to come true, and yet I could hope. And so, when my letter was completed, we brought up the little oilskin bag and signaled to those on the ship to haul upon the line. Yet, with all, there came a mighty splatter among the weed. They seemed unable to gather in any of the slack, and then, after such a pause, I saw a man in the lookout points point out something, and immediately afterwards it blenched out in front of me a little puff of smoke. And presently I caught the report of a musket, so that I knew that he was firing at something in the weed. He fired again, and yet once more, and after that they were able to hold upon the line, that I perceived that his fire had proved effectual. Yet he had no knowledge of the thing that for which he discharged his weapon. Now, presently, they signaled to us to draw back the line, which we could do only with great difficulty. The man atop of the superstructure signaled to us vast hauling, which we did, whereupon we began to fire into the weed. Though with that what effect we could not perceive. Then, and while he signaled to haul again, and now the rope became more easily, yet with much labor and commotion in the weed, which over it lay in pieces, sank. And so at last we cleared the weed because of the lift over the cliff. We saw that a great crab had clutched it, and that we hauled it towards us, for the creature had too much obstinacy to let it go. Perceiving this, and fearing that the great claws of the crab might divide the rope, the bosun cut one of us of the men's lances, and ran to the cliff edge, calling us to pull in gently, and put no more strain upon the line than need be. And so, hauling with great steadiness, we brought the monster near to the edge of the cliff, and there, at a wave from the bosun, stayed our pulling. Then he raised the spear and smote the creature's eyes, as he had done on previous occasions, and immediately it loosed its hold and fell with a mighty splash into the water at the foot of the cliff. And the bosun bade us to haul in the rest of the rope until we should come near to the packet, and in the meantime he examined the line to see whether it suffered harm through the mandibles of the crab. Yet, beyond little chafe, it was quite sound. And so we came to the letter, which I opened and read, finding to be written in the same feminine hand which had indicted the others. From it we gathered the ship had burst through the very thick mass of the weed which had compacted itself around her, and that the second mate, who was the only remaining officer remaining to them, thought it might be a good chance to have heave the vessel out, though it would be done with great slowness, so as to allow the weed to part gradually. Otherwise the ship would have but like to get a rake to gather the weed before it, and so form its own barrier to the clear water. And after this, there was a kind of wishes and hopes that we had spent a good night, in which we took promptly by the feminine heart of the writer, And after that, I fell wondering whether that was the captain's wife who acted as the scribe. And then I was awake from my pondering by one of the men crying out that they, in the ship, had commenced to heave again upon the big rope. And for a time, I stood and watched it rise slowly as it became to taunt us. I stood there a while, watching the rope. And suddenly there came a commotion on the weed about 2/3 of the way to the ship. And now that I saw the rope had freed itself from the weed, and clutching it were maybe a score of giant crabs. At this sight, some of them cried out their astonishment. And then we saw that there had come a number of men into the lookout place atop the superstructure, and immediately opened a very brisk fire upon the creatures. And so, by one and twos, they fell back into the weed. And after that, the men resumed their heaving. And so, in a while, the rope had some feet clear of the surface. Now, having taunted the rope so much as they thought proper, they left it to have its due effect upon the ship. And the boats proceeded to attach a great block to it, and they signaled to us to slack away a little on the rope until they had the middle part of it. And at this, they hitched it around the neck of the block, and to the eye of the strap of the block they attached the bosun's chair, so they had a ready carrier, and by this means they were able to haul stuff to and from the hulk without having to drag it across the surface of the weed. In being indeed the fashion which we had intended to haul ashore the people in the ship. But now the bigger project was salvaging the ship herself, and further, the big rope, which acted as support for the carrier, was not yet sufficient height above the weed continent for to be safe to attempt to bring any ashore by such means. And now that we had hopes of saving the ship, we did not intend to risk parting by the big rope by trying to attain such a degree of tautness as would be necessary this time to have raised its height to the desired height. Now presently, the bosun called out to one of the men to make breakfast, and when it came ready, we came to it, leaving the man with the wounded arm to keep watch. Then we had made it to an end. He sent him that he had lost fingers, keep a lookout whilst the other came to the fire and ate his breakfast. In the meanwhile, the bosun took us down to collect weeds and reeds for the night, and so we spent the greater part of the morning. And when we had made an end of this, we returned to the top of the hill to discover how matters were going forward. Thus, we found that one at the lookout, that they, in the bulk, had been obliged to heave twice upon the big rope to keep it off the weed. In this, we knew that the ship was indeed making a slow, stern way towards the island, stepping steadily through the weed. And as we looked at her, it seemed almost that we could perceive that she was near. But this was no more than imagination, for at most she could not have moved more than some odd fathoms. Yet it cheered us greatly, so that we waved our congratulations to the man who stood on the lookout on the superstructure, and he waved back. Later, we made dinner, and afterwards had a very comfortable smoke in the bosun attendant to our various hurts. And so, through the afternoon, we sat upon the crest of the hill overlooking the hulk, and thrice they in the ship had to heave upon the big rope, and by evening they made nearly 30 fathoms to the island, the which they told us in reply to a query which the bosun desired me to send them, several messages having passed between us in the course of the afternoon, so that we had to carry her upon our side. Further than this, we explained that we would tend the rope during the night, so that strain would be kept up, and more, this would keep the ropes out of the weed. And so, with the night coming down upon us, the bosun bade us to light the fires atop the hill, having been laid earlier that day. and thus, our supper being dispatched, we prepared for the night, and all through it burned the lights aboard the hull, which we proved to be very companionable to us in our times of watching. And so, at last came the morning. The darkness passed without event, and now, to our huge pleasure, we discovered the ship and made great progress in the night. Being now so much nearer that none could suppose the matter of imagination, for she had moved nigh 60 fathoms near the island. So now we seemed almost able to recognize the face of the man in the lookout, and many things about the hull we saw with greater clearness, so that we scanned her with fresh interest. And the man in the lookout waved a morning greeting to us, the which we returned very heartily. And even as we did, there came a second figure beside the man and waved some white matter, perchance a handkerchief, which, like enough seeing that it was a woman, and that we took off our head coverings, all of us, and shook them at her. After this, we went to our breakfast, having finished which the bosun dressed our hurts, and then setting the man who had lost his fingers to watch, he took the rest of us, expecting him that it was bitten in the arm, and down that fuel, and so the time passed until near dinner. When we returned to Hilltop, the man upon the lookout told us that they in the ship had heaved not less than 4 separate times upon the big rope, which indeed they were doing at the present moment. And it was very plain to see that ship had come near even during the short space of the morning. Now, when they had made the end of the taunting rope, I perceived it was at last well clear of the weed through all its length, being at its lowest part, nigh 20 feet above the surface. And at that, a sudden thought came to me, which sent hastily to the bosun, where it occurred to me that there existed no reason why we should not pay a visit to those aboard the hull. But when I put the matter to him, he shook his head, and for a while stood against my desire. For presently, having examined the rope, considering that it was the lightest of any in the island, he consented. And at that, I ran to the area which had been hauled across to our side, and got into the chair. Now, the men, so soon as they perceived my attention, applauded me very heartily, desiring to follow. But the bosun bade them to be silent, and after that he lashed me to the chair with his own hands, and then he signaled those in the ship to haul upon the small rope. He, in the meanwhile, checking my descent towards the weeds by means of our end of hauling the line. And so, presently, it come to the lowest part where the bight of the rope dipped downward in a bow towards the weed, and rose again to the miasmas of the hull. Here, I looked downward with some fearful sighs, for my weight on the rope made it snag somewhat lower than seemed to be me comfortable, and I had a very lively recollection of some of the horrors that the quiet surface hid. Yet, I was not long in this place, for they in the ship perceived how the rope let me near to the reed that was safe, pulled very hardly upon the hauling line, and so I came quickly to the hull. Now, as I drew nigh to the ship, the men crowded upon the little platform which they had built on the superstructure, somehow below the broken head of the mizzen. And here they received me with loud cheers and very open arms, and were eager to get me out of the bosun's chair, that they cut the lashings, being too impatient to cast them loose. And then they led me down to the deck, and here, before I acknowledged aught else, a very buxom woman took me into her arms, kissing me right heartily, at which I was taken aback. But the men about me did not but laugh, and so in a minute she loosed me, and there I stood, not knowing whether to feel like a fool or a hero, but inclining rather to the latter. And then, at this minute, there came a second woman who bowed to me in a manner most formal, so we might have met in some fashionable gathering, rather than in a castaway hulk in a lonesome terror of that weed-choked sea. At her coming, all the mirth of the men died out of them, and they became very sober, whilst the buxom woman went backwards for a piece, and seemed somewhat abashed. Now, at all this, I was greatly puzzled, and I looked from one to another to learn what might mean. But at the same moment, the woman bowed again and said something in a low voice touching the weather. And after that, she raised her glance to my face, and I saw her eyes, as they were so strange and full of melancholy, that I knew in an instant why she spoke and acted in such an unmeaning a way. For the poor creature was out of her mind, and when I learned afterwards that she was the captain's wife, and had seen him die in the arms of the mighty devilfish, I grew to understand how she had become to such a pass. Now, for a minute after I discovered the woman's madness, I was so taken aback as to be unable to answer her remark. But there appeared no necessity, for she turned away and went aft towards the saloon stairway, which stood open. And here she was met by a maid, a very bonny and fair, who led her tenderly down from my sight. That in a minute this same maid appeared and ran along the deck to me and caught my two hands and shook them, and looked upon me with such roguish, playful eyes that she warmed my heart, and which had been strangely chilled by the greeting of the poor mad woman. And she said many hearty things regarding my courage, to which I knew in my heart I had no claim. But I let her run on, and so presently, coming more possession of herself, she discovered that I was still holding my hands, in which indeed I had been conscious of the while with a very great pleasure. But at her discovery, she dropped them with haste, and stood back from me a space, and so there came a little coolness into her talk. Yet this lasted long, for we were both of us young, and I think that even thus early we attracted one another. Though part of this, there was so much that we desired each to learn, that we could not but talk freely, asking questions for questions and giving answer for answer. And thus as time passed, in which men left us alone, and presently went to the captain, about which they taken the big rope, and they toiled away a while. For already the ship had moved sufficiently to let its line fall slack. Presently, the maid, whom I learned was a niece of the captain's wife, was named Mary Madison, proposed to take me to the round ship, to which proposal I agreed very willingly. But first I stopped to examine the mizzen stump, and the manner in which the people of the ship had stated, the which they had done very cunningly, and I noted that they had removed some superstructure about the head of the mast, so to allow passage for the rope, without putting strain upon the superstructure itself. Then I made an end upon the poop, which led me down to the main deck. And here I was very greatly impressed by the prodigious size of the structure which they built about the hull, and the skill which they had taken to carry it out. The supports crossing from side to side, and the decks in a manner calculated to the great solidity to which they upheld. Yet I was greatly puzzled to know where they had gotten sufficient timber to make such a large matter. But upon this she satisfied me with explaining they had taken between the decks and used all such bulkheads as they could spare. And further, there had been a good deal among the dunnage which had proved usable. And so we came to the last galley, and here I discovered the buxom woman to be installed as a cook. And there were a couple of fine children, one whom I guessed to be the boy of some maybe 5 years, and the second a girl, scarce able to be more than a toddler. At this I turned and asked Mistress Madison whether they were her cousins, but in the next moment I remembered that they could not be, for as I knew the captain had been dead for some years. Yet it was this woman in the galley who answered my question, for she turned and, with something of a red face, informed me that they were hers, at which I felt some surprise, but supposed that she had taken passage in the ship with her husband. Yet in this I was not correct, for she proceeded to explain that, thinking they were cut off from the world for the rest of this life, falling very fond of the carpenter, they had made it up together some sort of marriage, and had gotten the second mate to read the service over them. She told me then how she had taken passage with her mistress, the captain's wife, to help her with her niece, who had been but a child when the ship sailed, for she had been very attached to them both, and they to her. And so she came to an end of her story, expressing hope that she had done none wrong by her marriage, none as should be intended. And to this I made answer, assuring her that no decent-minded man could think worse of her, but that I, for my part, thought rather the better of seeing that I liked the clock which she sat down, and that she cast down the soup ladle which she had in her fist, and came towards me wiping her hands, but I gave back for shame to be hugged again, and before Mistress Mary Madison, and at that she came to a stop and laughed very heartily, but all the same, called down a very warm blessing upon my head, for which I had no cause to feel the worse, and so passed on with the captain's niece. Presently, having made the round of the hull, we came aft again to the scoop, discovered that they were heaving once more upon the big rope, the which was very hard, and proving, as it did, the ship was still unmoved. And so, a little later, the girl left me having to attend to her aunt. Now, while she was gone, the men came all about me, desiring news of the world beyond the wee continent. And for the next hour, I was kept very busy answering their questions. And then the second mate called out to learn them to take another heave upon the rope. And at that, again, to the captain, and I with them. And so we hove taut again, after they got about me once more questioning, for it seemed to them to have happened in the 7 years in which I had been imprisoned. And then, after a while, I turned and questioned them on such points as I neglected to ask Mistress Madison, and discovered me to the terror and the sickness of the wee continent, its desolation and horror, and the dread which had beset them as the thought that they should fall, all of them come to their ends without sight of their homes and countrymen. Now, about this time I became conscious that I had grown very empty, for I had come off to the boat before we had made our dinner, and I had been in such an interest since, for the thought of food had escaped me, for I had seen none eating in the hall, they, without a doubt, having dined earlier than my coming. But now, being made aware of my state by the grumbling of my stomach, I inquired whether there was any food to be had at such a time, and at that one of the men ran to tell the woman in the galley that I missed my dinner. At that, she made me adieu, and said to prepare me a very meal, which she carried aft and set out for me in the saloon, and after that she sat me down to it. Presently, when I had come near to being comfortable, there chanced a loathsome step upon the floor behind me, and turning I discovered that Mistress Madison was surveying me with a roguish and somewhat amused air. At that, I got hastily to my feet, but she bade me to sit down, and therewith she took a seat opposite, and so bantered with me a gentle playfulness that was not displeasing to me, and at which I played so good a second I had the ability. Later, I fell to questioning her, and among other matters I discovered it was she who acted as a scribe for the people in the home, at which I told her that I had done likewise for those in the island. After that, the talk became somewhat personal, and I learned she was near on 19 years of age, whereat I told her I had passed my 23rd, and so we chatted on until presently it occurred to me that I had better be preparing to return to the island, and I rose to my feet with this intention, yet feeling that I'd very much happier to have stayed, in which I thought for a moment had not been displeasing to her. And at this I imagined nothing somewhat in her eyes I had mentioned that I must be gone. Yet it may be that I flatter myself. Now when I came out to the dock, they were busy again heaving taut the rope, and until they made an end, Mistress Madison, I filled the time with such chatter as an wholesome between a man and a maid who had not long met, yet find another pleasing company. Then, where at last the rope was taut, I went up to the mizzen staging and climbed into the chair, after which some of the men lashed me very securely. Yet when they gave the signal to haul me to the island, there came a while for no response, and then the signs that we could not understand, but no movement to haul across the weed. At that, they lashed me from the chair, bidding me to get out, whilst they sent a message to discover what might be wrong. As they did, and presently came back the word that the big rope had stranded on the cliff edge, and it must be slackened somewhat at once, which they did, and with many expressions of dismay. And so maybe an hour passed, which during we watched the men working at the rope, just where it came down over the edge of the hill. And Mistress Madison stood with us and watched, for it was very terrible. The sudden thought of failure, though it were but temporary, when they were so near to success. Yet, at last there came a signal from the island for us to loose the hauling line, which we did, allowing them to haul across the carrier, and so the little while they signaled back for us to pull it in, which we had done. We found a letter in the bag lashed to the carrier, which was the boatswain made it plain that he straightened the rope and placed fresh chaffing gear about it, so that it would be safe as ever to heave upon, but to put less strain. Yet he refused to allow me to venture across upon it, saying that I must stay in the ship until we were clear of the weed, for the rope had stranded in one place, and it had been so cruelly tested there might be some other points at which it was ready to give. In this final note was made well of us all very serious, for indeed it seemed possible that it was as he gestured. Yet they reassured themselves, pointing out that, like enough, it had been the shaft upon the edge of the cliff which frayed the strand, so that it had been weakened before it parted. But I remember the chaffing gear which the boatswain had put in the first instant, and felt not so sure. Yet I would not add to their anxieties. And so it came about that I was compelled to spend the night in the hull. But as I followed Mistress Madison into the big saloon, I felt no regret. I nearly forgotten already my anxiety regarding the rope. And out of the deck sounded the most cheerily clack of the capstan. Freed. Now, when the Mistress Madison had seated herself, she invited me to do likewise, at which we fell and talked. First touched upon the matter of the stranding rope, about which I hastened to assure her, and latter on to other things. And so, natural enough with the man and maid to ourselves, and here we are very content to let it remain. Presently, the second man came in with a note in the bosom, which he had laid upon the table for the girl to read, which she begged me to do also, and so I discovered that it was a suggestion, written very rudely and ill spelt, and that they should send us quantity of reeds from the island with which would be able to ease the weeds from somewhat around the stern of the hull, thus aiding in the progress. And so the second mate desired the girl to write a reply saying that they were very happy for the reeds and would endeavor to act upon this hint. And this Mistress Madison did, after which she passed the letter to me, perchance I desired to send any message, yet I had not, that I wished to say, and so handed it back with a word of thanks, and at once she gave the second mate, who went forthwith and dispatched it. Later, a stout woman from the galley came aft to set us out at the table, which I occupied the center of the saloon, and while she was at this, she asked for information on many things, being very free and unaffected in her speech. and seeming with less of deference to my companion than certain motherlessness. For it was very plain that she loved Mistress Medicine, and in this heart did not blame her. Further, it was plain to me that the girl had a very warm affection for this old nurse, which it was but natural seeing that the old woman had cared for her through all the past years, besides being companion to her, and a good and cheerful one, as I could guess. Now, while I passed in answering the buxom woman's questions, and at odd times such occasional ones were slipped in by Mistress Madison, and then suddenly there came the clatter of men's feet overhead, and later the thud of something big being cast upon the deck. And so we knew the reeds had come. And at that Madison cried out that we should go out and watch the men try upon the weed. For they proved use and ease in which lay in our path, then should we come more speedily to the clear water, and without the need of pulling so great a strain upon the hawser, and as had been the case hitherto. When we came to the poop, we found the men removing a portion of the superstructure over the stern, and after they took some of the stronger reeds and proceeded to work the weed that stretched away in a line with our tailfrail. Yet they anticipated danger and perceived, for there stood by two of the men and a second mate, all armed with muskets, and these three kept a very strict watch upon the weed, knowing, though much experience of its terrors, how that there might be a need for their weapons at any moment. And so, as a while passed, it was plain that the men's work upon the weed was having an effect, for the rope was stacked visibly. Those at the capstan had all that they could do, taking fleet with the tackle to keep it anywhere near tautness. And so, perceiving that they were kept at so hard, I ran to give a hand, which the mistress, pushing upon the capstan bars, might right merrily with the heartiness, and thus a while passed, and the evening came down upon the lonesomeness of the weed continent. There appeared the buxom woman, and bade us to come to our suppers, and her manner of addressing the two of us was the manner of one who ought to have mothered us. But Madison cried out for her to wait, that we had work to do, and the big woman laughed, and came towards us threatening, as though intending to remove us by force. And now at this moment came a sudden interruption which checked our merriment, for abruptly there sounded a report of a musket in the stern, and came shouts to the noise of two other weapons, seeming like thunder, being penned by the overarching superstructure and directly by the men about tailfrail gave back, running here and there, and so I saw the great arms that had come about the opening which they had made in the superstructure. The two of these flickered inboard, searching hither and thither. But the stout woman took a man near her and thrust him into danger, and after that she caught Mistress Madison up in her big arms and ran down towards the main deck with her. And after all, before I had come to full knowledge of a danger, but now I perceived that I could not do well further back from the stern, at which I did in haste come to a safe position. I stood and stared at the huge creature, its great arms vague, glowing in the dark, writhing about in vain, searching for a victim. Then returned the second mate, being more for having been for more weapons, and now I observed that he had armed all the men, and had brought up spare muskets for my use. And so we commenced, all of us, to fire at the monster, whereat we began to lash about most furiously. And so, after some minutes, it slipped away from the opening and slid down into the weed. Upon the several men had rushed to report that those parts of the superstructure which had been removed, and I with them. Yet there were sufficient for the job, so we had no need to do aught. Thus, before they had made up the opening, I had given the chance to look upon the weed, and discovered that the surface which lay between our stern and the island was moving in vast ripples, as though mighty fish were swimming beneath it. And then, just before the men put the last of the great black glasses with panels, I saw the weed all tossed up like a vast pot to boil. And then the vague glimpse of thousands of monstrous arms that filled the air and came towards the ship. And then the men had the panel back in its place, and were hasting to drive the supporting struts into the position. And this was done. We stood a while and listened, but there came no sound above that of the wail of the wind across the extent of the weed continent. And at that, I turned to the men, asking how it was I could hear no sounds of the creatures attacking us. And so they took me up into the lookout place, and from there I stared down into the weed. But it was without movement save for the stirring of the wind, and there was no sign of the devilfish. Then, seeing me amazed, they told me how anything which moved the weed seemed to draw from them from all parts. But they seldom touched the hulk unless there was something visible for them which they had movement. Yet, as they went on to explain, there would be hundreds and hundreds of them laying all about the ship, hiding in the weed, but that if we would not take care to show ourselves within their reach, they would have gone most of them by morning. And thus the men told me in a very matter-of-fact way, for they had become insured to such happenings. Presently, I heard Mistress Madison calling me by name, and so I descended out of the growing darkness to the interior of the superstructure. And here they had lit a number of rude, luscious lamps, the oil for which I learned later they obtained from a certain fish which they hunted at sea, beneath the weed, in a very large schools. It took near any sort of bait with great readiness. And so, when I climbed down into the light, I found the girl waiting for me to come to supper, for which I described myself to be in mightily agreeable humor. Presently, having made an end of eating, she leaned back in her seat and commenced once more to bait me into a playful manner, in which I appeared to afford her much pleasure, and which I joined with no less, so we fell presently once more earnest talk. And in this wise we passed a great space of the evening. Then there came a sudden idea that and what must she do but propose that we should climb to the lookout. And to this I agreed with very happy willingness, and to the lookout we went. Now, when we come there, perceived a reason for this freak. For away in the night, astern the hulk, there blazed halfway between the heaven and the sea a mighty glow. And suddenly as I stared, being numb with admiration and surprise, I knew that it was the blaze of our fires upon the crown of the bigger hill. For, all the hill being in shadow, hidden by the darkness, there showed only the glow of the fires, hung as if it were in the void, and a very striking and beautiful spectacle it was. Then, as I watched, there came a abrupt figure into the view upon the edge of the glow, showing a black in my environment. And this I knew to be one of the men, come to the edge of the hill to take a look at the hulk, or test the strain on the hawser. Now, upon my expression of admiration besides Mistress Madison, she seemed greatly pleased, and told me that she had been up many times in the darkness to view it. And after that we went down again into the interior of the superstructure, and here the men were taking further heave upon the big rope before settling the watches for the night, the which they managed by having one man at a time keep awake and call the rest whenever the hawser gave slack. Later, Mistress Madison showed me where I was to sleep, and so having bid another one of a very good warm good night, we parted. She going to see that her aunt was comfortable, and I out on the main deck to have a chat with the man on watch. In this way, I passed the time until midnight, and in that while we had forced to call the men thrice to heave upon the hawser. So quickly the ship began to make through the weed. Then, having grown sleepy, I said good night and went to my berth. And so I had my first sleep upon a mattress for some weeks. Now when the morning was come, I waked hearing Mistress Madison calling upon me from the other side of my door, and rating me very saucily for lie abed, and that I made good speed at dressing and come quickly to the saloon, where she had ready breakfast, and made me glad I had a wait. But first, before she aught else, she had me out to look at the place, running up before me, most merrily and singing in the fullness of her glee. And so, when I had come to the top of the superstructure, I perceived that she had very good reason for so much merriment. And the sight which came to my eyes gladdened me most mightily. Yet at the same time filling with great amazement. For behold, in the course of one night, we had made near unto 200 fathoms across the weed, being now what we had made previously no more than some 30 fathoms from the edge of the cliff, the weed. And there stood Mistress Madison beside me, doing somewhat of a dainty step dance upon the flooring of the lookout, and singing a quaint old lick that I have not heard that dozen years. And this little thing, I think, brought back more clearly to me than aught else how this winsome maid had been lost to the world for so many years, having been scarce at the age of 12 when the ship had been lost in the continent. Then, as I turned to make some remark, being filled with as many feelings, there came a hail from far above the air, as it might be, and looking up I discovered the man upon the hill be standing along the edge, and waving to us. And I now perceived how the hill towered a very great way above us, seeming as it were to overhang the hulk, though it were a mere some 70 fathoms distance from the sheer sweat of its nearest precipice. And so, having waved back to our greeting, we made down to breakfast, and having come to the saloon, set upon good victuals, and did a very sound justice thereto. Presently, having made an end of eating, and hearing the clack of the captain calls, we hurried out to the deck to put our hands upon the bars, intending to join in the last heave, which should bring the ship free of her long captivity. And so for a time we moved round the capstan, and I glanced at the girl beside me, for she became very solemn, and indeed it was a strange and solemn time for her. For she, who had dreamed of the world as her childish eyes had seen it, was now, after many hopeless years, to go forth once more to it, to live in it, and to learn how much had been dreams, and how much had been real. And with all these thoughts I credited her, for they seemed such as would become to me at such a time. And presently I made for some blundering effort to show her that I had an understanding of the tone which possessed her, and at that she smiled up at me with sudden queer flash of sadness and merriment. And our glances met, and I saw something in hers which was but newborn, and thought I was but a young man my heart interpreted for me. And I was all hot suddenly with the pain of sweet delight for this new thing, where I had not dared to think upon which already my heart had made bold to whisper to me. So that even thus soon I was miserable out of her presence, and that she looked downward at her hand upon the bar, and in the same instant there came a loud abrupt cry from the second mate, too vast heaving, and that all the men pulled out their bars and cast them upon the deck, and ran shouting to the ladder that led to the lookout, and we followed, and so came atop, and discovered that the last of the ship was clear of the weed and floating in the open water between it and the island. Now at this discovery the hope was free, and the men commenced to cheer and shout a very wild fashion, as indeed it was no cause for wonder, and we cheered with them. Then suddenly, in the midst of our shouting, Mistress Madison plucked me by the sleeve and pointed to the end of the island where the foot of the bigger hill jutted out in a great spur. And now I perceived a boat coming round to view, and in this moment I saw the bosun stood on the stern, steering. Thus I knew that he had finished preparing her, whilst I had been on the hull. By this, The men about having discovered the nearness of the boat and commenced shouting afresh, and they ran down to the bows of the vessel and got ready a rope to cast. Now, when the boat came near, the men and her scanned us very curiously, but the boatswain took off his headgear with a clumsy grace that became him. At which the Mistress Matron smiled very kindly upon him, and after that she told me with great frankness that he pleased her, and more, that she had ever seen so great a man, which was not strange, seeing that she had seen but a few since she come to the 20 years when men became of interest to a maid. After saluting us, the boatswain called out to a second mate he would tow us to the ground, to the far side of the island, and that this officer agreed, being, I surmise, by no means sorry to put some solid matter between himself and the desolation of the great reed continent. And so, having loosed the hawser, which fell from the hilltop with a prodigious splash, we had the boat head towing, and this wise we all popped out present the end of the hill. But feeling now the force of the breeze, we bent a hedge to the hawser, and the boatswain carrying it seawards, we warped ourselves to the windward of the island. And here, in 40 fathoms, we vast heaving, and we rowed to the kedge. Now, this was accomplished. They called out to our men to come aboard, and they did, and spent all of the day talking, eating, for those in the ship could scarce make enough of our fellows. And then, when it had become night, they replaced that part of the superstructure which had been moved, but the head of the mizzen stump, and so, all being secure, each one turned in, and had a full night's rest, of the which, indeed, many of them stood in sore need. The following morning, the second mate had a consultation with the boatswain, after which he gave the order to commence upon the removal of the great superstructure. And to this each one of us set himself with vigor. Yet it was a work requiring some time, and nearly 5 days passed before the ship stripped clear. And when this had been accomplished, it came a busy time for routing out various matters of which we should have need for jury-rigging her, for there had been long in disuse, and that none remembered where to look for them. And this day and a half was spent, and after that we set about fitting her with such jury mast as could manage from our material. Now, after the ship had been dismissed, all 7 years had gone, the crew had been able to save many of her spars, these having remained attached to her, although her inability to cut away all the gear had put them in a sore peril at the time of being sent to the bottom of the hole in her side. Yet now they had every reason to be thankful, for by this accident we had now a foreyard, a topsail yard, a malignant yard, and fore topmast. They had saved more than these, but I made use of the smaller spars to shore up the superstructure, sawing them into lengths for that purpose. Apart from these such spars as they could manage to secure, they had a spare topmast lashed along under the lock bulwarks, and the spar tugget, and the royal mast laying along the starboard side. Now, the second mate and the boatswain had set the carpenter work upon these spare topmasts, bidding him to make for some trestle trees and bolsters, upon which lay eyes of the rigging, but they did not trouble him to shape it. Further, they ordered the same to be fitted with a fore topmast, and spare tugget, and royal mast. And all the meanwhile, the rigging was prepared, and when this was finished, they made ready to the sheer to hoist the spare topmast, intending this to take the place in the lower mast. Then, when the carpenter had carried out the orders, he was set to make 3 partners with a step cut in each. These being intended to take the heels of the 3 masts, and when those were completed, they bolted them securely to the decks at the forepart of each of the struts of the 3 lower masts. And so, having already re-hove the main mast into position, after which we proceed to rig it. Now, when we have made it under this, we set to upon the foremast, using it for the fore topmast, which they had saved. And after that we hove mizmast into place, having this, the spare telegraph and royal mast. Now, the manner in which we secured the mast before it ever came to the rigging of them was by lashing them to the stumps of the lower mast. And after we had lashed them, we drove runnage into the wedges between the mast and the lashings, thus making them very secure. And so, when we had set up the rigging, we had confidence that they would stand all such sail as we should be able to set upon them. Yet, further than this, the boatswain bade the carpenter to make wooden caps of 6-inch oak. These caps fit over the squared heads of the lower mast stumps, and having a hole, each of them, to embrace the jury mast. By making these caps in 2 halves, they were able to bolt them onto the masts and have a hold them into position. And so, having gotten in 3 jury lower mast, we hoisted up the foreyard to the main, and acted as our main yard, and did likewise with the topsail and to the fore. And after that, we set up the gallant yard to the mizzen. Thus we had her sparred, all but the bowsprit and the jibboom. Yet this we managed by making a stumpy spike bowsprit from one of the smaller spars, which we had used to short the superstructure. And because we feared that it lacked strength to bear the strain of our fore and afts, we took down 2 hawsers and from fore and passing, and through the hawser hole, setting them up there. And so we had her rigged. And after that, we bent such a sail as that gear enabled us to carry. And in this wise we had the hull ready for sea. Now, the time that it took us to rig the ship and fit her out was 7 weeks, saving it 1 day. And all that time we suffered no molestation from any of the strange inhabitants of the weed continent, though this may have been because we kept fires of dried weed going all night about the decks. These fires being lit on a big flat piece of rock which we had gotten from the island. Yet for all that we had not been troubled, we had more than once discovered strange things in the water swimming near to the vessel. But a flare of the weed hung over the side on the end of a reed had sufficed, always to scare away such unholy visitants. And so at last, to the day which we came, we were in such a good condition that the boatswain and the second mate considered the ship to be in fit safe to put to sea. The carpenter had gone over much of the hull as he could get at, found everywhere very sound, though her lower parts were hideously overgrown with weed, barnacles, and other matters. Yet this we could not help. And it was not wise to attempt to scrape her, having consideration to the creatures which we knew abound in those waters. Now, in those 7 weeks, Mistress Madison and I had become very close to one another, so that I had ceased to call her by any name save Mary, unless it were a dearer one than that, though this would be of my own invention, and it would leave my heart to be naked did I put it out down here. Of our love for one another, I think yet, and ponder how that mighty man the boatswain came so quickly to acknowledge the state of our hearts. For he gave me a very sly hint one day, that he had a sound idea of the way the wind blew, and yet, though he said it was a half jest, we thought there was something which his voice, as he spoke, and that I clapped my hand in his, he gave a very huge grip. And after that, he ceased from the subject. How we came to our country. Now, when the day came when we made our leave in the nearness of the island, in the waters of that strange sea, there was great lightness of heart among us, and we went very merrily about such tasks as needful. And so in a little, we had the kedge tripped, and had cast the ship's head to the starboard, and presently had her braced upon the luck of our tack, and which we managed very well. Though our gear worked heavily, as might be expected, and after that we had gotten underway, we went to the lee side to witness the last of that lonesome island. And with us came the men of the ship, and so, for a space, there was silence among us, where they were very quiet, looking stern and saying not, but we had sympathy with them, knowing somewhat of those past years. And now the boatswain came to break up the poop, and called down to the men after muster aft, to which they did, and I with them, for some had regarded them very good comrades, and the rum was served out to each one, and among the rest, and it was Mistress Madison herself who dipped out from the wooden bucket, though it was the buxom woman who brought it up from the lazarette. Now, after the rum, the boatswain bade the crew to clear up the gear about the decks and get the matter secured, so that I turned to go on with the men, having become used to so much work with them. But he called upon me to come upon him, the which I did, and there he spoke respectfully, remonstrating with me, reminding me how there was no need no longer for me to toil, for that I was to come back to my old position of passenger, and as I had been in the Glen Carrig ere she foundered. But to this talk of his, I made reply that I had good right to work my passage home, as any other among us. For though I paid for a passage in the Glen Carrig, I have done no such thing regarding the seabird, this being the name of the hulk. And to do this, my reply, the boatswain said little, but I perceived he liked my spirit, and so far thence until we reached the port of London, I took my turn and heart in all seafaring matters, having become quite proficient in the calling. Yet, in one matter, I bailed myself from my former position, for I chose to live aft, and by this was able to see much of my sweetheart, Mistress Madison. Now after dinner, upon the day which we had left the island, the boatswain and the second mate picked the watches, and thus I found myself chosen to be in the boatswain's, in which I mightily pleased. And when the watches had been picked, they all had hands about the ship, the which, to the pleasure of all, she accomplished. For under such gear, and with so much growth upon her bottom, they had feared that she would have to veer, and by this we should have lost much difference to the leeward, whereas we desired to edge so much to windward as we could, being anxious to put space between us and that wee continent. And twice more that day we put the ship about, though the second time it was to avoid the great bank of weed that was laying up, floating athwart her bows, roll the sea to windward of the island, so far as we've been able to see from atop the higher hill, was studded with floating masses of the weed, like unto thousands of islets, and in place like far-spreading reefs. And because of these, the sea all around the island remained very quiet and unbroken, so that there was never any surf, nor scarce a broken wave upon its shore, for all that the wind had been so fresh for so many days. When evening came, we were again upon the larboard tack, making perhaps some 4 knots in the hour, though we have been in proper rig with a clean bottom. Yet we were making 8 or 9, so with a good breeze and so calm a sea. Yet, so far progress had been very reasonable, for the island lay maybe some 5 miles to leeward and about 15 astern. And so we prepared for the night. Yet a little before dark, we discovered the weed kind of trended out towards us, so that we should pass it, maybe at a distance of something like half a mile. And at that, there was talk between the second mate and the boatswain as to whether it was better to put a ship about to gain better sea room before attempting to pass this promontory of weed. But at last they decided that they ought not fear, for we had fair way through the water. Further, it did not seem reasonable to suppose that we should ought to fear the inhabitants of the Weed Covenant at such a great distance of half a mile. And so we stood on. For once past the point where there was much likelihood of the weed turning its way to the eastward, and if this were so, we could square immediately and get the wind upon our quarter and so make better way. Now as the bosun watched from 8 of the evening till midnight, and I, with another man, had to look out until the 4 bells. Thus I chanced that, coming abreast of the point during our watching, we peered very earnestly to leeward. For the night was dark, having no moon until the near of the morning, and we were full of unease in that we had come so near again to the desolation of that strange continent. And then suddenly the man clutched my shoulder and pointed in the darkness upon our bow, and thus I discovered that we were coming nearer to the weed than the bosun and second mate had intended, they without a doubt having miscalculated our leeway. At this, I turned and sang to the bosun that we were near to coming upon the weed, and in that same moment he shouted to the helmsman to loft them directly towards the starboard side, was brushing against the great outlying tufts of this point. And so, for breathless minutes we waited, yet the ship drew clear, and so into the open waters beyond this point. But I had seen something scrape against the weed, and with a sudden glimpse of white gliding along the growth. And then I saw others, and in a moment I was down on the main deck, running after the bosun midway along the horse-shaped beam above the starboard rail, and I gave a cry out of warning. And then I had the capstan bar, and back near I smote the thing, crying out wild for help. And my blow at the thing from my sight, and the bosun was with me, and some of the men. Now the bosun had seen my stroke and sprang up against the telegraph rail, peered over, but gave back at the instant, shouting me to run and call the others watch, for that the sea was full of the monsters swimming off to the ship, and that I was away at the run when I had to wake the men. I raced aft to the cabin, and did likewise with the second mate. And so, we turned in a minute, marrying the bows and the cutlass, my own cut and thrust, and the lantern that hung always in the saloon. Now and then I had gotten back, I found all things in a mighty scurry. The men running about in their shirts and drawers, some in the galley bringing fire from above, and others lighting a fire of the dry weed to leeward of the galley. And along the starboard rail, there was already a fierce fight. The men loosened capstan bars, ever as I done. And then, as I thrust the bosun cutlass into his hands, and he gave a great shout, part of joy and part of appropriation. And after snatching the lantern from me, he ran to the larboard side of the deck. I was well aware he had taken the light, but now I followed him. And as happy as it was for all of us in the ship, he thought them to go at that moment. For the light of the lantern showed me the vile faces of 3 of the weedmen, climbing over the larboard rail. Yet the bosun had left them, or ever I could come near. But in a moment, I was full busy, for there came nigh a dozen heads above the rail, after where I was, and at that I ran at them, and did good execution. But some had been aboard, if the bosun was under my help, and now the decks were full of light, several fires being lit, and the second mate having brought out fresh lanterns, and now the men had gotten the cutlasses, which were more handy than the capstan bars. And so the fight went forward, some having come over our side to help us. And a very wild sight it must have seemed to any onlookers, for all about the deck burned the fires in the lanterns, and along the rails ran men smiting at hideous faces that rose in dozens into the wild glare of our fighting lights. And everywhere drifted stench of the brutes. And upon the stoop the fight was as brisk as ever, and here having been drawn by fire cry for help. I discovered the boxwoman was smiting a gory meat axe at a vile thing, which had gotten a cup of its tentacles upon her dress. She had dispatched it, or ever my sword could help her. And then, to my astonishment, even at the time of peril, I discovered the captain's wife wielding a small sword, and her face was like that of a face of a tiger. Her mouth was drawn, her teeth showed, were clenched, and she uttered no word, no cry. And I doubted not that she had some vague idea as she worked her husband's vengeance. And then, for a space, I was busy as any, and afterwards I ran to the buxom woman to demand whereabouts of Mistress Madison, and she, in a very breathless voice, informed me that she was locked in her room out of harm's way, and that I could have embraced for the woman, for I had been sorely anxious to know my sweetheart was safe. And presently, the fight diminished, and so last came to an end. The ship had been drawn well away from this point, and now being in the open, and after I ran down to my sweetheart, opened the door, and thus for a space she wept, having her in my arms about my neck, for she had been in sore terror for me, and for that ship's company. But soon, drying her tears, she grew very indignant with her nurse for having been locked into her room and refused to speak to that good woman for near an hour. Yet I pointed out that she could be very great use in dressing such wounds as I had received. And so she came back to her usual brightness, and brought out bandages, and lint, and ointment, and thread, and was presently very busy. Now, it was later that there arose a fresh commotion on the ship, for it had been discovered the captain's wife was missing. At this bosun and second mate instituted a search, but she was nowhere to be found. Indeed, none of the ship ever saw her again, at which she presumed that she got dragged over by some of the weedmen, and so come upon her death. And at this there came a great prostration to my sweetheart, so that there would be comforted for the space of 3 days, by which the ship had come clear of those strange seas, having left incredible desolation of the weed continent so far over her starboard counter. And so, after a voyage which lasted 70 days since getting underway, we have come to the port of London, having refused all offers of assistance on the way. Now here I had said farewell to my comrades of so many months and perilous adventures. Yet, being a man not entirely without means, I took care of each of them, should have given a certain gift by which to remember me. And I placed money in the hands of the buxom woman, so that she should have no reason to tempt my sweetheart. And she having, for the comfort of her conscience, taken her good man to the church, set up a little house upon the borders of my estate. But this was not until the Mistress Madison came to take her place at the head of my hall in the country of Essex. Now, one further thing there is, which I must tell. Should any chance to trespass upon my estate, come upon a man of mighty proportions, albeit some bent by age, seated comfortably at the door of this little college, they shall know him as for my friend the bosun. For to this day do he and I foregather let our talk drift to the desolate places of this earth, pondering which upon we had seen the weed continents, where reigns desolation and the terror of its strange inhabitants. And after that, we talk softly of the land where God hath made monsters after fashion of trees. Then maybe my children come about me, so we change to other matters. For little one